The Galactic Council had 47 member species. Humans were not one of them. That was not an accident. That was a decision, a vote taken in the Great Chamber on Velthar Prime, with its high crystal ceilings and its carved stone seats, and its long history of cold, calculated exclusion. The vote had passed by 43 to 4. The 4 who voted against it were small species, young species, species who had once been weak themselves, and still remembered what it felt like to be told they did not belong. The 43 who voted yes had not even debated it for very long. One of the senior council members, a Dorai named Vel Khan, tall, silver-skinned, with 4 arms folded across his chest in that particular way that meant he had already made up his mind, had stood at the center podium and laid out the case in fewer than 10 minutes. Humans, he said, were too emotional, too unpredictable. Their biology was fragile. Their lifespans were short. Their governments argued with each other constantly. Their history was a long parade of wars fought over land, over belief, over things that did not matter. They were, in his assessment, a species that had barely survived itself. He had a point, several points actually. But he was also wrong. He just did not know it yet. The vote passed. Humanity was classified as a Grade 3 developing species, a label that meant they were watched, catalogued, occasionally studied, but never invited to the table, never consulted, never warned. The Galactic Council would protect its member species from threats. It would manage trade routes and resource disputes, and border conflicts between recognized civilizations. Humanity got none of that. What humanity got was a file, a thin clinical document stamped with the Council seal and stored in the archives where nobody ever looked. The file noted their location, their population count, their technological level at the time of assessment, which had been taken 80 years prior, when humans had barely put a handful of ships past their own moon. The Council had not checked the file since. This was, as it turned out, a serious mistake. The Scrath came from the Outer Rim. Nobody knew exactly where they had originated, because the Scrath did not talk. They did not negotiate. They did not send ambassadors or transmission signals or peaceful exploratory probes. What they sent were ships, black, angular vessels that moved in tight formations and hit targets without warning and left nothing behind worth salvaging. The first world they took was Porath IV. Porath IV was a Dorai colony, a mid-sized agricultural settlement with a population of around 800,000. It had no real military presence. It had defense satellites and a garrison, and the kind of security that was meant to handle smugglers and pirates, not an invasion fleet of 600 warships that dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the planet's northern hemisphere. The garrison lasted 11 minutes. The Council received the distress signal 17 hours later, when a courier drone finally made it to the nearest relay station. By then, there was nothing left to save. The Scrath had taken the surface, eliminated resistance, and moved on. They did not occupy worlds. They did not want populations or infrastructure or resources in any form that made sense. They simply came, destroyed, and continued moving. What they wanted was unclear. What they did was very clear. The Council convened an emergency session. Arguments broke out. The Dorai demanded immediate military action. The Thalani, pacifists by cultural doctrine, urged negotiation, though they could not explain how one negotiated with an enemy that never transmitted a signal. The Orani military bloc started calculating fleet responses and realized that a coordinated defense would take months to organize, during which time the Scrath would continue moving. Meanwhile, the Scrath continued moving. Porath IV, then the Yellen Passage, where 3 Orani cargo freighters were destroyed. Then a Dorai listening post near the edge of the Veth system. Then 2 Thalani science stations on the rim of charted space. The attacks were not random. There was a direction to them, a trajectory, a slow and terrible arc that the Council's analysts began mapping with increasing dread. The arc pointed toward the inner systems, toward the populated core of the galaxy, toward everything. Captain Sarah Voss of the Dorai fleet received her orders on a cold morning, in the 3rd cycle of the emergency mobilization. She was not a small woman. Dorai females ran tall, broad-shouldered, silver-skinned like all her kind, but she stood in the briefing room of the flagship Vel Shai and felt, for the first time in a long career, genuinely unsure. The briefing officer laid it out plainly. The Scrath fleet was now confirmed at over 2,000 vessels. The Council's combined military had assembled 640 warships. Reserve fleets were being recalled. Shipyards were running at maximum capacity. New vessels were being commissioned faster than crews could be trained for them. It was not enough. The math said it plainly. It was not enough. What about allied species? Voss asked. Non-council members. Anyone with ships. The briefing officer consulted his data slate. The Mora Confederation has offered 12 patrol cruisers. The Helen Assembly 8. Several smaller groups have pledged support, though their vessels are largely outdated. And the humans? A pause. The kind of pause that carries its own answer inside it. The humans, the briefing officer said carefully, are a grade 3 species. They are not equipped for this. Their most recent assessment, 80 years ago, showed. That assessment is 80 years old. Yes. Then we do not actually know what they have. Another pause. No, the briefing officer admitted. We do not. Voss stared at the star map on the table. The red markers showing Scrath movement made a shape that looked like a hand reaching inward. Fingers of destruction pressing toward everything she had ever known. Send them a message, she said. Captain, Council protocol prohibits direct military contact with Grade 3. Send them a message, Voss said again. Quieter this time, the kind of quiet that ends arguments. The message arrived at the human deep space relay station near Jupiter, on what was, on Earth, a Tuesday. Commander Adisa Okafor was not having a good Tuesday. He had been awake for 19 hours managing a debris-clearing operation in the outer belt, and had been approximately 4 minutes from handing his shift to his second-in-command, when the relay system flagged an incoming signal on a frequency humans never used, in a format humans had never transmitted, from a direction that pointed toward stars nobody in this system had ever visited. He stared at the message for a long time. It was in a language he did not speak. Most of it was raw data packets his system could not decode. But there were 3 things his system could decode, because the Dorai had been smart enough, or desperate enough, to encode them in universal mathematical notation. The first was coordinates. The second was a timestamp, roughly 6 weeks from now. The third was a number, a count of vessels, enemy vessels, 2,416. Okafor read it 3 times. Then he set his coffee down very carefully on his desk, which was something he always did when he needed a moment to think clearly, and he opened a direct channel to Earth Command. I need to speak to the Admiral, he said. The Admiral is in a budget review meeting, Commander. Pull her out of it. A pause. Sir, the Admiral. Tell her, Okafor said, that we just received first contact from an alien species, and that they are asking for help. The line went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Connecting you now, sir. Admiral Yue Shan had spent 31 years in the human space navy. She had seen the first generation of deep space warships built in the Martian yards. She had been one of the commanders of the Ganymede Accords, which had ended the last major conflict between Earth's competing national fleets, and unified them under a single command structure. She had watched the human military grow from a fragmented collection of national interests into something that surprised people who expected it to still be fragmented. She had been patient for 31 years. She listened to Okafor's report without interrupting. She looked at the decoded data. She looked at the coordinates, and the timestamp, and the number. Then she asked the question that mattered. What is our current fleet strength? Her aide pulled up the numbers without being told twice. This was because Admiral Shan had a way of asking questions that made people around her understand that the time for being slow was already over. The numbers came up. Shan looked at them. A small expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite something else. The look of a person who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has just recognized that the moment has arrived. Get me the shipyard commanders, she said. All of them. Earth, Mars, the belt stations, the outer yards. All of them, on a joint call, in 2 hours. 2 hours is very short notice, Admiral. Yes, she said. It is. She stood and walked to the window of her office. Outside, the curve of Earth was visible, blue and white and impossibly beautiful the way it always was, the way it had always been, the way it would continue to be if she did her job correctly in the next 6 weeks. "The Dorai sent us coordinates and a timestamp," she said, half to herself, half to her aide. "They sent us a number. They did not send us a request. Do you know what that means?" Her aide thought about it. "They are not asking permission." "No," Sean said. "They are asking for bodies. For ships. They expect us to show up with whatever we have and stand next to them while something very large tries to kill everything in its path." A pause. "They think whatever we have will not be enough," she continued. "They are asking anyway, because they have run out of other options." She turned away from the window. "They have not seen our yards," she said. "They have not seen what we have been building for the last 40 years, while they were busy deciding we were not worth talking to." She picked up her data slate. That is about to change. The message the council received 6 days later was not what anyone expected. It came through the same frequency the Dorai distress message had been sent on. It was clean, precise, encoded in a way that showed whoever sent it understood the council's communication protocols very well, understood them, and had taken the time to learn them without ever being taught, which was a small thing that several council analysts noted in their reports, and then set aside because there were more urgent matters. The message was short. It said, "We have received your signal. We understand the situation. We will be at the coordinates you specified at the time you specified. We will bring what we have. We ask only one thing, that no council vessel attempt to enter the following grid zones in the weeks before the engagement. These zones are active." Attached was a map. The map showed the grid zones. The grid zones covered an area of space that encompassed 5 human shipyard stations, 17 construction platforms, and a region of the outer asteroid belt roughly the size of a small moon. Velkan, when he saw the map, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite concern. "Active," he said. "They say the zones are active." "Yes," said his aide. "What does that mean?" "We are not sure," said his aide. "But perhaps it means they are building something." Velkan looked at the map for a while longer. He thought about the file, the thin, clinical file in the archives, the 80-year-old assessment that said humans were fragile and unpredictable and short-lived, and prone to fighting each other. He thought about the fact that nobody had checked that file in 80 years. "Get me an updated intelligence report on human military capacity," he said. "Sir, they are a grade 3. "Get me the report," he said. Same quiet as Captain Voss had used. Same end of arguments. The report, when it came back, took 3 days to compile. The analysts had to pull data from deep observation satellites that had been passively monitoring human space for decades. Satellites that collected data automatically, but whose feeds nobody had reviewed in a very long time, because nobody had thought it was necessary. When the report landed on Velkan's desk, he read the first page and went very still. He read the second page. He set the report down. He picked it up again. He read the key figures one more time to make sure he had not made an error. He had not made an error. 40 years, he said quietly to no one in particular. 40 years of building, 40 years of expanding yards and commissioning new classes of vessel, and running trials, and training crews, and doing all of it in their own space, in their own systems, without asking anyone's permission or seeking anyone's approval, because no one had told them they needed to, and no one had been watching. He thought about the Scrath fleet, 2,416 vessels. He thought about what was in the report. He thought about the 6 weeks remaining before the engagement at the coordinates the Dorai had sent. Velkan, for the first time in a very long political career, did not know what to say. So he said nothing. He just picked up his communication device and opened a direct channel to Captain Voss. "Captain," he said when she answered, "you were right to send the message." A pause on her end. "What did the humans say?" she asked. "They said they will be there." And, Velkan said slowly, "I think we may have made a very significant error in our assessment of them." Another pause. Longer this time. "How significant?" Voss asked. Velkan looked at the report on his desk, at the numbers on page 1, at the ship classes on page 2, at the weapon system specifications that had been collected by automated satellite and never reviewed by a single analyst until 3 days ago. "I will send you the file," he said. He did. Voss read it in her quarters that evening, alone, with the star map still glowing on her table and the red scrath markers still creeping inward. When she finished reading, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she said, to the empty room, what Velkan had not been able to say. "We had no idea." Outside her viewport, in the dark between the stars, 6 weeks away at a set of coordinates that had been chosen for the worst possible reason, something very large was coming. And from the other direction, from a small blue world that no one had bothered to watch carefully, something larger was on its way to meet it. There was a place in the outer belt called Forge Station Kira. It did not appear on any Galactic Council chart. It was not registered in any of the databases that the 47 member species shared with each other. It had no diplomatic status, and no formal name in any language other than the one spoken by the people who worked there, which was English, mixed with the particular shorthand that develops in places where everyone is too busy to use full words. The workers called it the Kira, or just K, or, when things were especially intense, just the place, said in a tone that meant everyone already knew. It was the largest single construction platform in human space. It was also, by a significant margin, the largest single construction platform in this region of the galaxy, though the humans who built it did not know that, because the Galactic Council had never shared information about its own shipyard capacities with Grade 3 species, and so the humans had no reference point. They had simply needed something large, and so they had built something large, the way they always did, without asking permission, without checking whether it was normal, without worrying whether anyone else thought it was appropriate. Kira had been operational for 22 years. It had been expanded 14 times. At full capacity, it could build 9 heavy warships simultaneously. At the moment, it was running at 112% capacity, which was a number that should not have been mathematically possible, but which the station chief, a compact and relentless woman named Director Pham Van An, had achieved through a combination of triple shift rotations, creative interpretation of safety margins, and a personal philosophy that could be summarized as, "The ships get built, or I die trying." She was not going to die trying. The ships were going to get built. Pham was in the Central Operations Hub when the Admiral's call came through. The Operations Hub was a large circular room bristling with screens and data feeds, and the constant low noise of several hundred people doing several hundred different things at the same time. The hub smelled like metal and recycled air, and the particular brand of terrible coffee that was the only kind available on Kira, because nobody had time to improve the coffee situation. Pham had 3 data slates open, a half-eaten meal bar in her left hand, and a running list of 11 problems she was currently solving when her personal communicator buzzed with a Priority 1 tag from Earth Command. She stepped into the quiet room, a small, sound-dampened space off the main hub that existed for exactly this kind of call, and picked up. "Director Pham," said Admiral Shan, "we have a situation." "I know," Pham said, because she had already seen the relay intercept. Word moved fast on Kira. "You want the new commission list fulfilled ahead of schedule." 6 weeks, Shan said. Pham ate the rest of her meal bar. She did not respond immediately, because the fastest version of this conversation was one where she thought before she spoke. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, Shan confirmed. "I have 7 hulls in varying stages of completion. 2 are 80%. The rest are between 40 and 60. Can they be finished? They can be finished faster than normal finishing. I need to know what you are actually asking for. Full spec, combat ready, or floatable and armed?" A pause. "What is the difference, operationally?" "Full spec takes 6 more weeks for the 2 that are 80%. Floatable and armed takes 3. The ones at 40 to 60% are more complicated. I can get them to minimum combat standard in 6 weeks if I strip the secondary systems and pull crews from everything else." Strip the secondary systems. Life support stays. Weapons stay. Engines stay. Navigation stays. Everything that makes them comfortable to live in for extended deployments does not stay. The crews will hate it. "The crews," Shan said, "will understand." "Yes," Pham said. They will. Then do it. Yes, Admiral. She paused. I want you to know that the Kira is not the only yard. There are 4 others at similar stages. Helios platform, the Mars belt stations. I know, Shan said. I am making this call 17 more times today. Good, Pham said. And then, because she was Pham, and because the quiet room did not have anyone else in it, Admiral. Yes. How many are coming? A beat of silence. 2,416, Shan said. Pham looked at the wall of the quiet room. She thought about the number. She ran the math, the way she always ran math. Automatically, without effort, because she had been running numbers since she was a child and the running never really stopped. She thought about what she had, what all the yards together had, what 6 weeks of maximum output would add to that. We can do this, she said. Not a question, not reassurance, just the output of the math. I know, Shan said. The call ended. Pham walked back into the operations hub. The noise hit her immediately. The controlled chaos of a station that was already working at its limit. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. People glanced at her. They could read her. They had worked with her long enough to know that the look on her face right now meant something significant had just been decided. Listen up, she said. Not loudly. She did not need to be loud. The hub went quiet faster than it had any right to. She told them. Not all of it, not the number, just the timeline, just the mandate, just the shape of what the next 6 weeks needed to look like. The hub was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then it was louder than it had ever been, because 400 people were all updating their work orders at the same time. 6 weeks. It was not a long time. It was not enough time, by any normal measure. Humans had a long history of doing things in not enough time. The first deep space engine had been prototyped in less than a decade after the initial theoretical breakthrough, a pace that had shocked the handful of Galactic Council observers who had been passively monitoring human technological development and had expected the process to take at least a century. The first human warship had been commissioned 11 years after the first human reached open space. The unified command structure had been assembled in the aftermath of a conflict that lasted only 4 years, a conflict that, from the outside, had looked like a catastrophic failure, and from the inside had been, in its terrible way, the furnace that welded everything together. Humans did not take long. Humans took as long as necessary, which was usually shorter than anyone expected. The yards ran. Kira ran at 114% capacity, then 118, as Pham found additional efficiencies the way a person finds water, not by knowing exactly where it is, but by being willing to look in every direction until something wet appears. Helios platform extended its operational hours. The Mars belt stations recalled off-rotation crews. 3 smaller yards that had been scheduled for maintenance cycles delayed those cycles indefinitely, because there was no version of this where a maintenance cycle mattered more than the next 6 weeks. Ships took shape. The Ardent-class destroyers, lean, fast, built for interdiction and flank operations, came off the platforms first, because they were the simplest to complete. 11 of them in 3 weeks, 7 more in the 2 weeks after that. The crews were already waiting. The crews had been briefed. The crews were, to a person, exactly as focused as Pham's hub workers. The kind of focus that happens when people understand the stakes clearly and have decided, collectively, that the stakes are acceptable. The Sovereign-class heavy cruisers took longer. They were larger, more complex, armored in layers of reactive plating that took time to cure, armed with the long-range siege cannons that the human navy had spent 15 years developing in the quiet of the outer testing ranges, away from any satellite that might have been watching. 8 Sovereigns were in various stages of completion. 5 were finished in time, 3 were finished late, by a matter of hours, and joined the fleet at the rally point with their paint still setting in the cold of space. And then there were the Endurance-class carriers. The carriers were the thing. They were the reason the grid zones had been marked as active, the reason the Council had been asked to stay out of that region of space. Not because the building of them was secret, not anymore, not with 6 weeks on the clock, but because a carrier under construction in a live yard took up an enormous amount of space and moved in unpredictable ways, and the last thing anyone needed was a Council observation vessel drifting into the construction arc of a 2-kilometer hull assembly. There were 4 endurance carriers in the fleet already, operational, crewed, running regular exercises. 3 more were being finished. The Council's intelligence report, the one Velkan had ordered and received and gone very quiet over, had identified the 4 existing carriers but had not been able to assess their full capacity, because the carriers had never operated at full capacity during the observation period. They had been running at standard exercise parameters, which were, by design, conservative. Standard exercise parameters were not what the carriers were built for. The Endurance class could carry, in its fighter bays, 240 interceptor craft. It could manufacture ammunition for its own weapons systems using onboard fabrication units, which meant it did not need resupply during an engagement if the engagement lasted less than 72 hours. It was armored to withstand sustained bombardment from weapons systems 2 classifications above anything currently in service with any Council military. Its hull was built from an alloy developed in a lab on Luna 18 years ago that had no name in any alien language because no alien had ever encountered it. Admiral Shan had named it, informally, during the first trials. She had watched a test projectile hit the plating and leave a mark the size of her hand. She had said, "That'll do." The name had not stuck officially, but the sentiment had. Captain Marcus Webb commanded the carrier Uns Relentless, which was the oldest of the 4 operational endurance-class vessels, and also, by common consensus among its 3,000-person crew, the best. This was not an objective assessment. It was the kind of conviction that forms in a crew over years of working together, irrational in its foundation, useful in its effect. Webb received his orders from Admiral Shan personally, in a transmission that was short and precise, the way Shan's communications always were. The transmission said, "Rally point, coordinates attached, 3 weeks from now, full combat loadout." Then it said, "We are the first response. There will be others alongside us. They have been fighting this enemy already and they are losing. We will not be losing." Then it said, "This is not a drill." Webb passed the orders to his crew, section by section, because on a vessel with 3,000 people, you passed information methodically, or it became noise. He watched their faces as the section briefings went out. He had been reading his crew's faces for 11 years. What he saw was this: not fear exactly, not the absence of it either. Something in between. The thing that lives between knowing a risk is real and deciding to walk toward it anyway. He had seen it before. He had felt it himself, in the years before command, standing on the lower decks of other ships, hearing other captains give briefings that changed the weight of the air. It was the thing humans were, perhaps, better at than they understood. Carrying the weight. Walking toward the thing. He went to his observation deck that evening, a small, rarely used space at the forward section of the carrier, with a viewport that faced out into open space, rather than toward the ship's operational areas. He stood there for a while in the dark, looking at the stars. He was thinking about the Dorai, about the message that had come from a species that had voted to exclude humanity, and then, when they ran out of options, had sent a distress call. He was thinking about the 2,000 ships coming from the Outer Rim. He was thinking about Porath IV, which his intelligence briefing had described with the clinical precision of a military report, and which he kept translating, without meaning to, into the actual shape of 800,000 lives. 800,000. 11 minutes of resistance. He put the number away and kept it. This was something he had learned to do: put numbers in a particular place, behind a particular wall, and access them only when access was useful rather than paralyzing. The wall was not denial. The wall was function. He turned away from the viewport and went back to his command deck. There was work to do. Across human space, in those 6 weeks, things moved. Ships left their docks and rallied at designated coordinates. Supply vessels loaded with ammunition and fuel, and the particular mix of equipment that a fleet carries when it is going to do something real. Medical ships were commissioned. Converted freighters, mostly, larger than purpose-built medical vessels could be built in 6 weeks, and crewed with every available trauma specialist in the military medical corps. The rally point was 3 days of travel from the engagement coordinates the Dorai had sent. This was intentional. It gave the fleet time to form up properly, to run system checks, to transfer personnel between ships where crew assignments had been scrambled by the acceleration of the build schedule. It also gave the Council fleet time to see them coming. This was not entirely unintentional. The Council's forward observation post near the rally coordinates picked up the human fleet on its sensors 48 hours before the scheduled rendezvous. The observation officer on duty stared at his sensor display for a long time. Then he ran a diagnostic to make sure the display was working correctly. Then he ran it again. The display was working correctly. He sent the data back to the Council flagship. The Council flagship was commanded by Admiral Vel Khan, who had taken personal command of the combined fleet because he was, at his core, a military officer who did not send others to do what he would not do himself, and because standing on the bridge of a warship felt, at this particular moment, more honest than standing in the Council chamber. Vel Khan received the sensor data. He looked at it for a long time. The human fleet was large. It was not just large in the way that a number on a page is large. It was large in the physical sense, in the sense of filling a section of space with metal and engine light, and the particular visual weight of vessels that had been built to withstand things. The carriers alone were visible from an extraordinary distance. 7 of them, each one almost 2 kilometers long, each one with fighter bays that, according to the data now scrolling across his screen, were at full capacity. Around the carriers, destroyers in formation, running escort patterns with a precision that spoke of long practice. Cruisers arrayed in the heavy support positions, support vessels slotted into the gaps. A fleet that moved like a single organism, not like a collection of individual ships. A fleet that had clearly been doing this together for a long time. Vel Khan thought about the file again, the 80-year-old file. He thought about what he had told the Council, what he had told everyone. Grade 3 species, fragile, unpredictable, not equipped. He had been looking at an 80-year-old photograph and describing a living thing. He opened a channel to Captain Voss, who was on the bridge of her own vessel 3 kilometers away. "Captain," he said. "I see them," Voss said. Her voice was even, controlled. She was very good at controlled. "How many do you count?" Vel Khan looked at the sensor data. "More than enough," he said. Something shifted in his voice. Not quite relief, not quite wonder. The thing between those two, which did not have a clean name in his language. He made a decision. He opened the general channel, the fleet-wide channel that went to every vessel in the combined Armada, Council and human alike. He said, "All stations. The human fleet has arrived. Adjust formation to receive Allied vessels. And," he paused, "give them room. They will need room." He closed the channel. He looked at the sensor display one more time, at the 7 carriers, at the destroyers running their precise escort patterns, at the Armada that had been built in the years when nobody was watching, in the yards that had never slept, by a species that had been told it did not belong at the table, and had, without complaint, simply built a bigger table of its own. 2 days until the Scrath arrived. Whatever came next, whatever the next 48 hours held, whatever the mathematics of the coming battle produced, one thing was already settled in Vel Khan's mind. He would never call them a Grade 3 species again. 47 hours before the Scrath fleet arrived, the 2 armadas met in open space. It was not a ceremony. There was no fanfare, no formal parade of ships past each other, no coordinated lighting display or diplomatic exchange of flags. There was simply a point in space where the human fleet slowed and the Council fleet adjusted, and the 2 groups of vessels found themselves occupying the same general region for the first time in the history of their respective species, which was a significant thing that nobody had time to properly appreciate because there was a great deal of work to do. Admiral Shan's flagship, the Uns Meridian, was a heavy command cruiser, not the largest ship in the human fleet, because the largest ships were the carriers, but the one with the most communications equipment and the most space for the kind of coordinated planning that needed to happen in the next 47 hours. It had a conference room that seated 40. The conference room was designed for this. Vel Khan's shuttle docked with the Meridian 90 minutes after the fleets merged. He walked into the conference room with Captain Voss and 2 of his senior tactical officers. He had been in many rooms with many commanders across a long political and military career. He had sat at tables with species who thought very differently from Dorhai, who had bodies and customs and languages that required careful navigation. He had never walked into a room and felt what he felt when he sat down across from Admiral Yue Shan. She was not physically imposing. She was a small human woman, slight in the way some humans were, with gray at her temples and very direct eyes, and hands that moved when she spoke with a precision that suggested she had been making important points with her hands for a very long time. She wore her uniform with the ease of someone who had worn it for so long that it was simply skin. She looked at him across the table and said, without preamble, "I want to talk about the tactical picture. Not about the vote, not about the exclusion, not about the 80 years, nothing about any of it. Just the tactical picture." Velkan felt something he had not expected to feel, which was respect that arrived before it was earned, based purely on instinct. He had not expected the instinct. He noted it and set it aside. "Yes," he said, "let us talk about the tactical picture." The Scrath, as Velkan's analysts understood them, fought in one way. They formed a mass, a single enormous formation, all their vessels together, tight enough that independent targeting was difficult, a wall of black metal and weapons fire that moved as one unit and hit targets with everything it had simultaneously. It was the military equivalent of a fist, dense, overwhelming, effective against opponents who tried to meet it in the same way. Every council species had tried, at one point or another, to meet it the same way. Porath 4 was the result. "The problem," Velkan said, standing at the tactical display in the conference room, "is that matching their mass formation with our own simply means we lose at slightly higher cost. We do not have the numbers." "Then we do not match their formation," Shan said. "The alternative strategies have been modeled. Flanking operations require speed we do not have. Encirclement requires numbers we do not have. Long-range bombardment has been attempted. The Scrath have counter-systems we do not fully understand, and the effectiveness has been poor." Shan nodded. She was looking at the tactical display. She had a way of looking at things, a stillness in her attention, that reminded Velkan of the senior tactical officers he had respected most in his career. The ones who did not perform thinking but actually did it, visibly, in real time. "What is the targeting solution for the carriers?" she asked. One of her own officers, a young man named Commander Park, who handled fleet weapons coordination, leaned forward. "The carriers operate as fire platforms for the interceptors. Our fighter craft will engage at close range. The carrier's own weapons are designed for capital ship targets." "The Scrath formation," Shan said. "It is dense." "You said it is dense." "Yes," said Velkan's tactical officer. "Too dense for individual targeting to be efficient." "Is it too dense for area weapons?" A pause. "Area weapons," said Velkan slowly. "You are talking about the siege cannon systems. Your cruisers. My cruisers have 5 Sovereign-class vessels. Each Sovereign carries 4 long-range siege cannons. The siege cannon is not a precision weapon. It is designed for saturation, for hitting a broad area with high-yield projectiles at range." She tapped the display. "A dense formation is not a problem for saturation fire. A dense formation is an ideal target for saturation fire." The room was quiet. Velkan's tactical officer ran the numbers. He ran them twice. Then he looked up with an expression that was difficult to read but that contained, at its edges, the shape of someone who has just seen something they did not expect to see. "At maximum range," he said slowly, "with all 5 Sovereigns firing in coordinated salvos, the projected impact coverage on a formation that dense would do significant damage," Shan said, "before they reach engagement range." "Significant," the tactical officer said. He paused. "Admiral, the term I would use is devastating." "Good," said Shan. "Devastating is what we need." The plan came together over the next 36 hours. It was not a simple plan. Simple plans existed for simple problems, and the problem before them was not simple. It was 2,000 ships coming to kill everything in a wide arc of space, operated by a species that did not negotiate and did not slow down, and had never, in the recorded history of their engagement with the galaxy, been stopped. The plan had layers. The outer layer was the Sovereign cruisers. They would position at maximum range and open fire the moment the Scrath fleet came into their targeting envelope. Saturation salvos, coordinated, timed to hit the formation from multiple angles simultaneously. The goal was not to destroy the formation, not at that range, not with what the Sovereigns had. The goal was to disrupt it, to break the perfect density that made it a fist and turn it, even slightly, into something less unified. The second layer was the interceptors from the carriers. 7 carriers, 240 fighters each, just under 1,700 fighter craft, running in coordinated waves, hitting the disrupted formation at close range, while the Scrath were still reacting to the siege cannon strikes. Human interceptor doctrine had been developed over 20 years of exercises and one significant conflict, the Belt War, which nobody outside human space knew about, and it was built on a principle that was simple to describe and difficult to execute. Speed. Overwhelming, distributed, constantly moving speed. Never stop. Never form a line. Hit and move and hit from somewhere else. Be in 10 places before the enemy has processed that you were in 1. The third layer was the destroyers, running interdiction on the Scrath vessels that broke from formation under fire. The destroyers were fast. They were built to chase. When a Scrath ship tried to retreat or redirect, a destroyer group would be waiting. The fourth layer, the depth of the plan, the thing that held it all together, was the combined council and human capital ships, positioned in reserve. Vel'Kon's fleet alongside the human heavy cruisers that were not sovereigns, holding position until the formation was sufficiently disrupted, and then moving in for the decisive engagement. Reserve was not the same as holding back. Reserve was the hammer, waiting for the moment when the nail was in position. They will adapt, Vel'Kon said, when they had gone through the plan 3 times. The Scrath are not strategic in the way we understand strategy, but they respond to threat. When the saturation fire begins, they will change. Yes, Shan said, and so will we. She looked around the room at the assembled officers, her own people, his people, mixed together now in a way that 6 weeks ago would have seemed impossible. The plan is not a script, she said. The plan is a starting position. What matters after that is how fast we read what is happening, and how fast we make decisions. I have been told that the Scrath have never faced an opponent who moved faster than they expected. That is accurate, Vel'Kon said. They seem to have a model of how their enemies will fight. They are very good at defeating that model. Then we will not fight that model, Shan said. We will fight the way that humans fight, which is, she paused, and something moved across her face that was close to humor, in ways that tend to surprise people. The Scrath came out of faster-than-light travel, at 0400 hours, ship time. They came exactly where the predictive models said they would. 2,416 vessels, black and angular, dropping into normal space in a formation so tight it looked, on the sensor displays, like a single enormous object rather than thousands of separate ships. Captain Webb was on the bridge of the Relentless when the proximity alerts began. He watched the formation appear on his display. He had seen the models. He had seen the projections. He had sat in 2 briefings where Vel'Kon's analysts had shown simulated versions of this moment. The simulation had not captured the scale of it. All pilots to fighters, he said. His voice was steady. This was not an accident. Steadiness was a choice, made deliberately, because his crew was watching his face and his voice and making decisions about their own steadiness, based on what they saw. Launch authorization on my mark. Across the bridge, his crew moved. No wasted motion, no panic. The kind of efficiency that comes from years of drilling the same sequence, until the sequence is not a thing you do, but a thing you are. 80 kilometers away, the Sovereign-class cruisers were already positioning. Commander Park's voice came over the fleet channel, calm and precise. Sovereigns in position. Targeting solution confirmed. Waiting for Admiral Shan's mark. Shan's voice came next. Not dramatic, not a speech, just fire. The siege cannons fired. The Scrath formation had survived everything the galaxy had thrown at it. It had absorbed sustained energy weapon barrages. It had pushed through missile volleys. It had closed on defensive lines and broken them, and kept moving, because mass and density and forward momentum had always been enough. The siege cannon salvos were not energy weapons. They were not missiles. They were kinetic, enormous masses of dense alloy, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, designed to hit not with precision but with area. When the first salvo connected with the outer edge of the Scrath formation, It did not pierce a single ship. It struck 7 ships simultaneously and kept moving, and the physics of that event were not survivable, and the resulting debris field struck 4 more ships, and the shock wave from those impacts rippled through the dense formation in a way that would not have happened if the formation were not dense. The density was the problem. A spread-out fleet absorbs hits in isolation. A dense formation shares them. The second salvo hit 30 seconds after the first, then the third, 5 sovereigns firing in alternating rhythm. Not all at once, which would have given the formation time to react between salvos, but in a continuous drumbeat of high-yield impacts that gave it no time to do anything except take the hit and absorb and take the next one. On the bridge of his flagship, Velkan watched the Scrath formation begin to break apart at its edges. He had seen the models. He had approved the plan. He had not entirely believed the models until this moment. "They are disrupting," his tactical officer said, voice controlled but carrying an edge of something he was trying not to show. "The outer formation. They are dispersing. It is working." "Phase 2, Shan said over the command channel. "All carriers," Webb said, on the relentless bridge. "Launch." 1,700 fighter craft came out of 7 carriers in waves. The launch sequence for a single carrier took 4 minutes. With 7 carriers running staggered launches, the fighters came out in a continuous rolling wave, not all at once, which would have created a traffic problem, but in an orchestrated sequence that had been practiced so many times that the pilots ran it in their sleep. The fighters moved fast. They moved faster than the Scrath's targeting systems could comfortably track, especially now, when those systems were already occupied with the continuing siege cannon salvos still hammering the outer formation. They moved in fluid, distributed patterns. No lines, no columns, no formations that could be predicted and countered. They moved the way a school of fish moves, which is to say they moved as individuals who were also somehow a single thing, reading each other's movements and adjusting without needing to speak. The Scrath formation, disrupted, tried to respond. The response was what it had always been: concentration of fire, mass weapons output, the enormous weight of 2,000 ships trying to bring their weapons to bear on targets that were too fast and too distributed to be brought to bear on efficiently. Some fighters were lost. This was not a perfect outcome. The mathematics of 2,000 ships firing could not produce a perfect outcome. Pilots died in the first wave, and the second, and the losses were real and costly and not minimized in any accounting. But the interceptors kept moving, and the siege cannons kept firing, and the Scrath formation, designed to be dense, was bleeding from 100 directions at once. Captain Voss, on her Dorai warship, watched the engagement on her tactical display with the focused attention of someone who has spent 30 years learning what battle looks like and is now seeing something new. She had fought before. She had studied combat history across a dozen species. She knew how battles moved, the rhythm of them, the shape they took as 2 forces found each other's edges. This did not have the shape she knew. This had a different shape, faster, more fluid, more willing to change, not in response to failure but in anticipation of what the next moment would require. The human commanders were not reacting, they were projecting. They were 3 moves ahead, and using the present moment to set up a future moment that their opponent had not yet conceived of. It was not a style of warfare she recognized. It was effective with a completeness that she found, despite everything, quietly extraordinary. "They are retreating," her tactical officer said, disbelief barely contained. "Admiral, the Scrath outer formation. They are beginning to—" "I see it," Voss said. She did see it. On her display, the mass of black angular ships, the formation that had taken Porath 4 in 11 minutes, that had destroyed the Yellen Passage freighters without a lost vessel, that had swept through the outer systems without meaningful resistance, was doing something it had apparently never done before. It was pulling back, not a full retreat. The formation was large enough that pulling fully back was a slow process, but the direction of movement had changed. The inward pressure, the relentless forward push that had characterized every Scrath engagement on record, had stopped. The formation was moving laterally, then backward, then into patterns that Voss's tactical display assessed as defensive restructuring. The Scrath were trying to reorganize. Admiral Shan, Voss said, opening the command channel. They are restructuring. If they are allowed to reform. They will not be allowed to reform, Sean said. Then, to the fleet. Reserve formation. Advance. This was Velkan's moment. His fleet, the Council warships, the full strength of the assembled Dorai and Orani and allied species military, had been waiting here, in reserve, while the humans ran their plan. They had watched. They had held position. They had been the hammer waiting for the nail. The nail was in position. Velkan looked at his bridge crew, his officers, the people he had served with for years. All vessels, he said. Advance. Full power. The battle lasted 9 hours. In the final accounting, in the reports that would be written afterward, in the analyses that would fill entire volumes in military archives across the galaxy, the turning point was identified as the moment the Scrath formation lost its coherence. Once dense mass became scattered individuals, the tactical advantage that had made the Scrath unstoppable evaporated. Individual Scrath vessels were not weak, but they had never been designed to fight individually. They had been designed to be part of the fist. When the fist broke, so did the strategy that the fist depended on. The destroyers did their work. The interceptors continued. The reserve fleet hit the disrupted formation with everything it had, and the combined weight of Council and human capital ships in coordinated strikes was, finally, sufficient. The battle was not bloodless. Ships were lost. Human ships, Council ships, vessels with crews who had understood the risk and gone forward anyway. The losses were real, and they mattered, and no celebration afterward ignored them. But the Scrath fleet did not pass the engagement point. Of 2,416 vessels, 922 were destroyed. The remainder retreated, true retreat, full retreat, a withdrawal that took them back toward the outer rim and continued past it. The tracking systems watched them go, watched the direction, confirmed the trajectory. They were going back. Whether they would come back was a question for another day. Questions for another day had to wait, because the present day had its own weight. On the bridge of the Relentless, Captain Webb sat in his command chair after the last of the Scrath signals dropped off the tracking display, and did not say anything for a moment. Around him, his crew was managing the post-engagement checklist, damage assessment, medical calls, fighter recovery, the 100 practical things that come immediately after a battle and do not wait for anyone to process what has just happened. He did not try to stop them. The work was necessary. He just sat for a moment with the silence inside the noise of the bridge, and he thought about the 922 destroyed Scrath vessels. He thought about Porath 4. He thought about the carriers and their pilots, and the ones who had not come back. He thought about the fact that it was over. For now, for this day, it was over. He got up and went back to work. Outside the viewports of the Relentless, the stars were visible again. They had not gone anywhere, of course. The battle had not moved them. Stars do not move for anything. But there was a moment, in the thick of it, when all the weapons fire, and the debris, and the dense black of the Scrath formation had made the stars hard to see. They were clear now. Clear and very bright, and exactly where they had always been. The day after the battle was a strange day. It was strange because battles end, and the silence that follows them is a different kind of loud, not quiet, never quiet, because there is always too much to do, too much to fix, too many reports to file and bodies to account for, and systems to repair. But a different kind of loud. The noise of aftermath, which is softer and heavier than the noise of engagement. Admiral Shan spent most of it in the Meridian's medical bay. Not as a patient. She was not hurt. She spent it walking through the bay, talking to the crew members who were hurt, the pilots who had taken hull damage and ejected into space and been recovered, the deck crew from the carrier fortress who had been in an internal section when a Scrath weapon punched through the secondary hull plating, the engine room personnel from the destroyer Swift Lance, who had been working the damage control line when the ship took its worst hit. She did not make speeches at them. She did not tell them they were heroes, or that what they had done was extraordinary. She asked them their names. She asked them what had happened in the moments she could not see from a command bridge. She listened. This was something about Shan that her staff had come to understand over the years. She collected these accounts not for the historical record, not for the after-action report, but because she believed that a commander who did not walk through the medical bay after a battle had not fully paid the cost of ordering people into it. The cost was not guilt. Guilt was useless. The cost was witness. You paid attention to what your decisions had produced. You kept the full account. She was on the third section of the bay when a call came through from Velkan. She stepped into the corridor to take it. "Admiral," he said. His voice was different from the day before, not weaker. Velkan did not do weak, but there was a texture to it that had not been there in the conference room, something that live combat does to even very experienced officers. "Admiral Velkan," she said, "how is your fleet?" "Damaged but operational. We lost 14 vessels." A pause, the kind of pause that does not invite comment. "The Council combined losses are significant. Your fleet's losses: 11 ships, 43 fighters in the recovery zone. We are working through casualty counts now." A quiet on the other end. Then, "You lost fewer." "We ran the plan that fit our capabilities," Shan said. "That was not a coincidence." "No," Velkan said. "It was not." Another pause. Longer. "Admiral Shan," he said carefully, "there are things I need to say that the Council has not asked me to say, that I am saying because they are true, and because not saying them would be a kind of dishonesty I am not willing to maintain." "Go ahead," she said. "We excluded your species from the Council 41 years ago. The vote was 43-4. I was among the 43. A pause. "The reasoning was considered sound at the time. The file on humanity was thin, and the assessment was, I have learned, 80 years out of date, and entirely incorrect. We made a decision about your species based on a data set that had expired before most of your current naval officers were born." Shan said nothing. "We sent you a distress signal when we ran out of other options," Velkan continued. "We did not invite you to the table when we should have. We invited you to the fire when we were desperate." He paused. "I do not know what the right words are for what that was. I know it was wrong." Shan looked at the wall of the corridor. A standard metal wall scratched in one place where something had been moved against it improperly. She looked at the scratch. "What would you like from me, Admiral?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I am not asking for forgiveness or absolution. I am not sure that is mine to ask for. I am telling you what is true because I think you deserve to hear it plainly, and because I think that if we are going to talk about what comes next, for both our peoples, it should not be built on a silence where this should be." Shan stood in the corridor for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "It is more than I expected." "It is less than what is owed," he said. "But it is a start." "Yes," she said. "It is a start." The Council's emergency session was convened 2 days after the battle, via long-range transmission from the engagement zone. Velkan chaired it from the bridge of his flagship, which was irregular by every procedural standard the Council had. He did not particularly care about that. The session was short. He presented the engagement report. He presented the casualty figures, the tactical analysis, the confirmed withdrawal trajectory of the Scrath fleet. He presented the contribution breakdown, which species had committed what, and what effect it had had on the outcome. The human contribution occupied its own section of the report. When he read it aloud, the Council chamber, even transmitted over distance, even pixelated and slightly delayed by signal lag, went very quiet. 7 Endurance-class carriers, he read. 5 Sovereign-class heavy cruisers, 18 Ardent-class destroyers, 41 support vessels, total crew complement, 212,000 personnel, fighter complement, 1,680 operational at engagement start, 1,407 recovered after engagement. He paused. These figures do not include the vessels that performed the siege cannon saturation fire, which was the tactical element that disrupted the Scrath formation and made all subsequent operations possible. The siege cannon doctrine was entirely a human development. No Council species had been informed of its existence or its capabilities. He looked up from the report. Around the transmitted chamber, 46 Council representatives, the full membership, everyone present, were looking at him. They were a Grade 3 species, one of them said. The Thalani representative, Aurea Vel, an older female with the careful voice of someone who chose words with deliberate precision. When the vote was taken, they were a Grade 3 species. When the vote was taken, Velkan said, they were already building the forge station Kira. which has been operational for 22 years. A silence. "What are they now?" said the Irani military representative. Not challenging, a genuine question. The question of someone trying to recalibrate a model that has just been proven wrong. "They are what they always were," Velkan said. "We simply did not look." Captain Voss visited the Uns Relentless on the third day. It was not an official visit. There was no protocol for unofficial interspecies visits between Allied vessels that were not treaty partners, which described the current situation precisely. So Voss simply sent a request through the fleet communication system and received a reply within 20 minutes that said, "Of course, please come." Webb met her at the docking bay. He was taller than she had expected. Dorai tended to be the tallest species in most rooms, but humans had more variation than her briefings had suggested, and Webb was one of the taller ones. He shook her hand with the human two-handed grip, which she had read about but not experienced, and it was different from what she had imagined. Warmer, in the literal physical sense, because human body temperature ran higher than Dorai. "Captain Voss," he said, "welcome aboard the Relentless." "Captain Webb," she said, "thank you for the invitation." She had intended the visit to be brief, a courtesy, a small acknowledgement of the fact that they had fought alongside each other, and that acknowledgement felt correct. It lasted 3 hours. Webb walked her through the ship, not the command sections, the working sections, the parts that most visitors to a flagship never saw. The fighter bays, where the recovered interceptors were being inspected and repaired by crews who worked with the focused efficiency of people who understood that those same fighters might be needed again. The fabrication units in the carrier's belly, which were running replacement parts for the weapon systems that had taken minor damage. The mess hall, where Webb seemed to know every person they walked past by name, and where every person seemed unsurprised to see their captain walking through with a silver-skinned alien officer, which told Voss something about the kind of ship this was. She asked about the fabrication units. She had read about them in the intelligence report, but seeing them was different. Webb explained them plainly, not simplified, not technical, just clear. The units could manufacture ammunition for the carrier's primary weapons from raw material feedstock stored in the ship's lower holds. The feedstock capacity allowed for approximately 80 hours of sustained fire. The system had been designed by an engineer named Kapoor, who had been working on the problem for 7 years, and who had solved it the way Voss was beginning to understand humans solved things, by refusing to accept that it could not be done until it had been done. Dr. Kapoor is on Kira Station right now, running system diagnostics on the newer carriers, Webb said. She would probably enjoy hearing that her work was useful. She should hear it, Voss said. Tell her, from me, that it was significant. Webb smiled. Dorhai did not smile. Their facial structure did not produce the same expression, but Voss had been around humans long enough in the past week to read the smile, and what she read in this one was genuine. They ended up in Webb's observation deck, the small forward viewport space. She stood next to him and looked out at the open space beyond the carrier, where the scattered debris of the engagement still drifted, catching starlight in small bright flashes. "What happens now?" she asked. Not strategically, not politically, just the question. Webb was quiet for a moment. "We go home, eventually. Repair what needs to be repaired. The fleet rotates. People get shore leave, and it's the best shore leave they've ever had." He paused. "The Scrath will come back, probably. Something like them always does. And you will come back too." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Without drama, just yes. The way a thing is said when it is simply true. Voss looked out at the stars. She thought about Porath 4. She thought about the 900,000 people on the Council worlds that had not been reached by the Scrath fleet because of the engagement they had just survived. She thought about the vote, 41 years ago. She thought about what the galaxy might have looked like if someone had thought to check the file 15 years ago, 10 years ago. She decided not to spend too much time thinking about that, because the past was fixed and the present was not. "Captain Webb," she said, "when the Council votes on the question of human membership, and they will vote soon, I am told, I will be speaking in favor. I want you to know that." Webb looked at her. "I would have spoken in favor anyway," she said, "but I want you to know that the last 3 days changed something in how I will say it, not the argument, the weight behind the argument. I appreciate that, Webb said. You should also know that Velkan will be speaking in favor, and that the Thalani representative, despite being very embarrassed about the vote 40 years ago, has already drafted a statement. The Orani military bloc is not going to fight it. Webb nodded, slowly, not triumphant, something quieter than triumph. The expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door to be unlocked and is not yet quite sure how they feel about walking through it. It was never about the council, he said. We were always going to build what we built. We were always going to be what we are. The council recognizing it, that matters. It matters because it changes what we can do together, but it does not change what we already did. Voss considered that. No, she said, it does not. Back on Kira Station, the yards were already running again. Not at the emergency pace of the past 6 weeks. That pace was not sustainable for long stretches, and Pham knew the limits of her people and her machines, and the intersection of the two, but running, steady, the methodical output of a facility that had never really stopped. New commissions were on the board. The Admiralty had sent a revised projection for fleet needs over the next decade, a projection that had been updated in light of the Scrath engagement data, which showed that the threat was real and persistent, and would require a standing response capacity significantly larger than the pre-engagement standard. Pham had read the projection. She had run the numbers against current capacity and projected expansion. She had called a meeting with her station chiefs and spent 4 hours talking through the plan. At the end of those 4 hours, she had looked around the room at the people who ran Kira, her people, the ones who had just built a fleet in 6 weeks on top of everything else they were already doing, and she had said what the math said. We will need to be larger. Nobody argued. We will need to be faster. Nobody argued. This was not the last time we will be asked to produce something in not enough time. A few people smiled, not because it was a pleasant prospect, because they knew it was true, and knowing something true, even a difficult true thing, is its own kind of solid ground to stand on. Then we get larger, said the chief of Hull Assembly, a broad-shouldered man named Torres who had been on Kira for 15 years and had opinions about efficiency that bordered on religious. And faster. Yes, Pham said, we do. She went back to her operations hub. She picked up her 3 data slates. She looked at the board of active projects, the running lists, the numbers, and timelines, and resource flows that were the language of the yards. She started working. The council formal vote on human membership was scheduled for 6 weeks after the battle. In the interim, a liaison office was established on the Meridian, the first formal diplomatic presence between humanity and the Galactic Council in the history of their respective existences. It was small, 2 rooms, 3 human staff and 2 council translators, but it existed, and its existence was not ceremonial. Velkan sent a formal message to Admiral Shan the day the liaison office opened. It was brief. He did not write long messages. He found them inefficient. It said, "The office is open. I think this is overdue by several decades. I am glad it is happening now. I look forward to what we can do together that we could not do separately." Shan read it twice. She wrote back 3 words. So do I. She meant it in 2 directions, as the straightforward response to his message, and as the answer to a question that nobody had formally asked, but that had been present in the air since the moment 2 fleets had looked at each other across open space and recognized, for the first time, what they were each actually looking at. Not a grade 3 species and its galactic superiors. Not a weak and fragile people and the civilizations that had decided they were not worth the vote. Just 2 groups of people who had needed each other, who had come through a hard thing together, who were now standing at the beginning of what came after. What came after was going to be interesting. It was going to be interesting in all the ways that things are interesting, when 2 very different kinds of capable look at the same problem and decide to solve it together. The liaison office opened at 0800 hours, ship time. The coffee machine in the second room broke before noon. By 1300, a human engineer and a Dori technical specialist had fixed it together, improvising a solution from parts that were not precisely compatible, but that worked when handled with enough creativity. It was a small thing. It was also, in its small way, Exactly the kind of thing that the next chapter of everything was going to be made of. The vote was 47-0. Not 43-4. Not a close thing. Not a grudging majority. 47 voices in the great chamber on Velthar Prime, with its crystal ceilings and its carved stone seats, and not one of them against. The Thalani representative, Aurea Vel, gave the formal speech, introducing the membership resolution. She spoke for 11 minutes. The speech had been written with care. She was, as Voss had said, genuinely embarrassed about the vote 40 years ago, and the speech acknowledged it plainly, without excessive performance. Embarrassment without drama. Acknowledgement without theater. The kind of honesty that is harder to produce than passion. Velkan seconded the resolution. He said 4 words, his name, and, "I second this." Then he sat down. He had said everything worth saying to Shan personally, and anything beyond that felt to him like decoration on a building that was already standing. The vote was called 47-0. Admiral Shan received the result in her office on Earth, where she had returned 2 weeks after the battle to handle the 1,000 administrative details that pile up when a fleet has been mobilized on emergency timelines. She was reading a damage assessment report on the destroyer Swift Lance when the notification came through. She read it once. She set the notification aside and went back to the damage assessment. This was not indifference. This was the behavior of a person who had spent 31 years working toward a thing and, when the thing arrived, found that the work had already been its own satisfaction. The vote confirmed what the battle had established. The battle had established what the yards had built. The yards had built what the people had conceived of and committed to over 40 years of patient, unrecognized effort. The vote was real. It mattered. It opened doors that had been closed. But doors are only as useful as what you do when they open. She finished the damage assessment. She filed it. She moved to the next report on her stack. When her aide knocked and put a head through the door and said, "Admiral, the vote came through," she looked up and said, "I know." 47-0, the aide said. He could not keep the grin off his face and did not appear to be trying very hard. "Yes," she said. How do you feel about that?" Shan put down her data slate. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I feel," she said, "like there is a great deal of work to do." The aide's grin stayed on his face. He knew this answer. He had worked with her for 6 years, and he knew this answer meant she was happy. "Yes, Admiral," he said. The formal ceremony admitting humanity to the Galactic Council was held 3 weeks later on Velthar Prime. It was the first time most humans had seen the Great Chamber in person, rather than in photographs or transmissions. The photographs had not done it justice. The crystal ceilings caught the light from Velthar's sun and broke it into spectra that made the room feel like the inside of something alive, breathing color. Admiral Shan attended as the primary human representative, alongside a civilian delegation of 12, diplomats, scientists, a historian, an engineer from Kira Station who had been included at Shan's personal insistence, and who spent most of the ceremony quietly stunned by the architecture. Captain Voss attended as part of the Dorai delegation. She sat across the chamber from Shan and did not acknowledge her with anything visible, but when Shan walked to the center of the floor to receive the formal welcome, the ancient council ritual, the words said the same way they had been said for 300 years of new memberships. Voss watched with an attention that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Velkan stood beside Shan for the formal portion. He placed his upper right hand, the one used for formal commitments in Dorai culture, on the council seal. Shan placed her right hand next to his. The council elder, ancient and slow and carrying the particular gravity of someone who had presided over this ceremony many times and understood its weight, said the words, "And humanity was in." Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, the wide, stone-floored corridor where delegations stood and talked in the loose post-ceremony way of people who have done a formal thing and are now relaxing back into being themselves, Velkan found Shan standing by one of the high windows that looked out over Velthar Prime's capital city. "You are quiet," he said. "I am thinking," she said. "About?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city of Velthar stretched to the horizon, an alien city, beautiful in its way, built with an aesthetic sense that was not human, but that was legible as beautiful, because some things are. She had never seen it before today. She was looking at it the way you look at something you have heard about for a long time, and are now finally seeing with your own eyes. About what we did not know about each other, she said, and what we still do not know, and how long it will take to close the distance. A long time, Velkan said. Yes, but possible. Yes, she said again, possible. He stood beside her at the window for a while. An old Dorai military officer and a small human woman looking at a city neither of them owned, which belonged to a species neither of them was, standing on a planet that was not theirs, and both of them comfortable in that, which was not the smallest thing that had happened in the past 2 months. There will be another vote, Velkan said. Not today, but soon. A vote on the expanded defense treaty, a formal agreement to share intelligence, to coordinate military response, to maintain joint patrol routes. I know, Shan said. It will pass. I know that too. Are you prepared for what that means? Operationally. Not challenging. Just asking the real question. The professional one. Because underneath all the ceremony and the politics and the significance, Velkan was still primarily a military officer, asking another military officer a military question. Shan turned from the window and looked at him. Velkan, she said. We built a combat fleet in 6 weeks. We developed a weapons system that cracked the Scrath formation and sent 2,000 ships into retreat. We built Kira Station with no outside help, no resources beyond our own, and no one watching. She paused. Yes, she said. We are prepared. He held her gaze. Then he said the only honest response. Yes, he said. I believe you. 3 months after the battle, Captain Marcus Webb took the Relentless on its first joint patrol. The patrol route had been established under the new framework, a preliminary version of the expanded defense treaty, operational before the formal signing, because threats did not wait for documents to be finalized, and everyone involved understood that. The joint patrol involved 3 human warships, 2 Dorai cruisers, and 1 Orani fast-response vessel. It was the first time human and council vessels had operated under a unified command structure. Webb commanded it. This had been Velkan's suggestion and Shan's decision, and the Orani representative's slightly surprised agreement. It was appropriate, Velkan had argued, not because humans were superior, but because the engagement model they had used had proven effective, and the engagement model was Webb's domain, and the point was not prestige but outcome. The Orani representative had thought about it and said, correct, the point is outcome. So Webb commanded. He ran the patrol the way he ran everything, methodically, with full information shared across all vessels, with clear communication protocols that had been agreed on in advance because communication failures in joint operations were a known problem that good preparation mostly solved. He ran daily briefings that included all 6 captains, which was time-consuming, but produced the shared picture that allowed each vessel to act independently, without losing coordination. The Dorai captains adapted to the briefing structure quickly. They were, Webb found, exceptional communicators, disciplined and precise, and willing to flag uncertainty, rather than covering it with projection, which was the specific quality in a military partner that mattered most in his experience. The Orani captain, a female named Sarath with a dry and very specific sense of humor, had a tendency to suggest improvements to Webb's patrol patterns during briefings, which he found valuable rather than irritating and said so, which surprised her and produced a working relationship that was, after 2 weeks, genuinely efficient. The patrol was uneventful. The Scrath had not returned to this region. Other threats, piracy, a border dispute between 2 minor species that required a mediating presence, were handled smoothly. Nothing dramatic happened. This was the point. The patrol was not drama. The patrol was the daily work of an alliance that was learning to function. Unglamorous, slow in places, occasionally frustrating in the way that all new things are frustrating when the processes are still being built. On the 21st day of the patrol, Captain Sarath of the Orani vessel Veth Prime sent Webb a personal message. Not a fleet message, a personal one. It said, Captain, I have served with council partners for 18 years. I have run joint patrols with Dorai, Thalani, Mora, and several species whose names I will not attempt to transmit in this format. I want to tell you something plainly. The way your fleet operates, the briefing model, the information sharing, the willingness to adapt the plan when conditions change, is different from anything I have encountered in Council joint operations. I do not know if you are aware of how different. I thought you should be told. Webb read it in his quarters. He read it twice. Then he wrote back. Captain Sarath, thank you. We have had a long time to practice. We look forward to learning from you as well. He meant the second part as much as the first. He did not say it to be diplomatic. He said it because it was true. Because 40 years of building in isolation had also been 40 years of not having partners to test ideas against. And now they had partners, and the value of that was not small. He sent the message and went back to his patrol log. On Earth, in a city by a coast, there was a museum. It was not a famous museum. It was a mid-sized regional institution with a permanent collection of local history and a rotating gallery that changed every few months. The current rotating gallery was new. It had opened 3 weeks after the council vote, timed not by intention but by coincidence, the way things sometimes line up when the world is moving in a particular direction. The gallery was called What We Built When Nobody Was Watching. It had photographs of the yards, Kira, Helios, the belt stations, taken during the mobilization period and released after the battle by the Admiralty as part of the general public briefing. Photographs of ship frames rising in the dark of space, of workers in suits doing delicate things at impossible heights, of the slow and patient accumulation of metal and purpose. It had interviews with some of the builders. Pham was in 3 of them, saying the things she said, precise, direct, without ornament. Torres from the hull assembly team, a young welder named Gao who had been working on the Ardent destroyers and who had found out about the battle only after it was over, and who described, in the interview, sitting in the break room on Kira and realizing that the ship she had spent the last 4 months welding had just come back from doing what it was built to do. I had not thought about it that way, she said in the interview. You build the parts become the ship. The ship is a thing that goes away and does something you never see, and then you find out what it did. She paused. It did what we built it to do, she said. That is a good feeling. That is a very good feeling. The museum was not crowded the day it opened. Museums rarely are. People came in 1s and 2s, families on a weekend afternoon, school groups that moved through in loose clusters and stopped where the photographs held their attention. One photograph held most of their attention. It was taken from outside the Relentless, by an external camera on a drone, during the battle. The timing of it was a matter of record. It was taken at the moment the 7th carrier launched its fighters, at the moment all 1,700 interceptors were in space simultaneously, at the maximum output of the human fleet. The photograph showed the carriers in the background, 7 enormous vessels, their fighter bays open, the trails of fighter craft still visible as fading streaks of light. In the foreground, slightly out of focus, was a portion of the Scrath formation, the dense black mass of it, the angular ships packed together. And between the two, in the space that separated the human fleet from the enemy fleet, was an extraordinary amount of fire. Not metaphorical fire. Actual light, the weapons fire from the Sovereigns, the engine trails of fighters, the detonations of Scrath vessels caught in the saturation zone, all of it overlapping into something that looked almost beautiful from the outside, which was one of the terrible things about battles photographed from a distance. The light in the photograph was real. All of it had done real things to real ships with real people in them. But the photograph also showed something else. It showed that the fire was moving in one direction. The Scrath formation, even in the still image, even without motion, was clearly pulling back. The shape of it was different from any photograph the intelligence archives held of Scrath engagements. In every previous photograph, the Scrath formation was a fist moving forward. In this photograph, the fist was open, disrupted, being pushed back. The school groups stood in front of the photograph for a long time. The teachers tried to explain context and usually gave up quickly because the photograph was, in some ways, its own explanation. One of the children, a small girl, maybe 9, standing in a group from an elementary school that had come in on a Tuesday, looked at the photograph for a very long time. She turned to her teacher and said, "Did we really do that?" Her teacher looked at the photograph. Yes, the teacher said. We really did that. The girl thought about it. How? She said. Her teacher did not give a speech. Teachers rarely have time for speeches on field trips. Because we have people, the teacher said. Very good people. Who built very good things, and went when they were needed. The girl looked at the photograph one more time. I want to build things, she said. Her teacher smiled. Then you should, said her teacher. The Scrath came back. Not soon. Not in the year of the battle, or the year after, or the 3 years after that. But they came back, 7 years later, and the arc of their approach was toward the same region of space, toward the inner systems, toward the populated core, toward everything. The difference, 7 years later, was everything else. The Joint Patrol Network was operational across 14 systems. The intelligence sharing framework had identified the Scrath buildup 4 months before the fleet crossed the Council border, which was 4 months of preparation that had not existed the first time. The defense treaty was signed, ratified, and operational. The treaty included mutual defense clauses that had never existed between any species in Council history, clauses that committed full military capacity, not reserve elements or diplomatic gestures, but actual warships and actual crews, and the actual weight of everything each signatory had to bring. The human fleet was larger. 7 years was a long time when you ran yards that never slept. There were 7 additional endurance carriers, 12 more sovereigns, 41 more destroyers, 2 new vessel classes that had not existed at the time of the first engagement, the Titan-class battleships, which were something the human navy had been designing theoretically for a decade, and had finally had the resources and the strategic justification to actually build, and the Swift-class courier destroyers, which existed at the suggestion of a Dorai tactical officer named Commander Orus, who had joined the Joint Command Staff 18 months earlier, and identified a gap in the patrol doctrine that the human designers had not seen. The Swift class was a Dorai idea built in human yards, with an Orani-designed drive system. The Council's fleet was also larger. The intelligence sharing had included, at Shan's formal request, human weapons development research. Not everything, but the relevant systems, the ones that applied to the joint defense mission. The siege cannon technology had been shared. The Dorhai had adapted it for their own cruiser classes. The Orani had developed a variant for their fast-response vessels. The Thalani, who by doctrine did not build offensive weapons, had contributed something different. A sensor network so sophisticated that the joint fleet had better situational awareness in the engagement zone than any single species had ever achieved in their own territory. When the Scrath came back, they came back toward an alliance that had 7 years of practice being an alliance. They came back toward a fleet that knew how to fight together. The battle was different from the first one. Not easier, the Scrath had adapted, in their way, had come with more vessels and a modified formation structure that suggested some form of analysis had occurred in the years between. They were not the same enemy they had been. But the alliance was not the same either. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Scrath retreated after 4, when it became clear that the formation disruption tactic was working again, and that the fleet they were facing was not going to be stopped by adding more ships to a strategy that was already failing. They retreated further this time, past the outer rim, past the charted edge of known space, into the dark beyond where no signal had followed them yet. Whether they would come back a third time was not known. What was known was what they had come back to find, an alliance that worked, a fleet that was larger and better and more coordinated than the one they had faced before, a joint command structure that had spent 7 years removing every friction point that could be removed and learning to work around the ones that could not. A species, once excluded, now at the center of the defense that kept the galaxy whole. The day after the second battle, Velkan sent Shan a message. He was older now, 7 years older, which was not very much for a Dorai, but which showed in the careful pace of his messages and the economy of his language, which had always been spare, and was now even more so, as if he was down to the only words that still seemed necessary. The message said, "They came back. We held. You were right. It was possible." Shan read it in the same office where she had read the first council vote result, years ago. The scratch was still on the wall. Nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it, which was the kind of small detail that persists in busy places, because the people in them always have more urgent things to attend to. She wrote back, "We were right. It was possible. What comes next?" His reply took 3 hours, which was long for Velkan. It said, "Everything. Everything comes next." She read it twice. She thought about the child in the museum, a child she did not know, had never met, who had stood in front of a photograph and said she wanted to build things. She thought about Pham, who was still running Kira, still holding 3 data slates, still finding efficiencies where there should not have been any. She thought about Torres, and Gao, and Webb, and Sareth of the Orani Veth Prime, and Commander Oris with his Swift-class idea that had filled a gap nobody had seen. She thought about 47 votes. She thought about what 47 species could do together, now that they had learned how to do it. Now that the worst thing had come twice and been survived twice. Now that the thing that fear had made impossible was no longer impossible, because it had been done, and the doing of it had changed the shape of what was imaginable. Everything comes next. She put the message down. She picked up her next report. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a complaint. That was the point.